once upon a time, Father arrived. To great admiration, praise, and applause, coupled with one of the greatest official Genshin animations of all time. Arguably one of the best demo OST beat drops of all time, and of course, being one of the most generally favored DPS characters of all time. And now, the fourth still, Fatui Harbinger, is ready for a rerun. And naturally, the big question is, should you get her? Hello everyone, welcome back. Alright, it's time. We gotta decide whether or not it's still worth getting Arlecchino during her rerun, now that of course Mavuika is in the game. Because that's the real question, isn't it? Mavuika's release sent shockwaves throughout the community as more people were making videos discussing and fearing power creep in the game. But none were more shook than Arlecchino mains. Dare I say, this is probably how Hu Tao mains felt when Arlecchino was first released. But first, don't forget to subscribe. This is of course going to be yet another Should You Pull video, and I tend to do quite a lot of them, so definitely subscribing keeps you up to date with various other videos that are coming out on this channel. 89% of y'all haven't subscribed yet, so maybe you should just do that. After all, it doesn't cost you anything. This is YouTube. This ain't Twitch. It does make, of course, content creators like myself feel better about ourselves in the morning, so it's a win-win situation. Maybe you should just do that. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's talk about Arlecchino and whether or not she's still a character worth pulling with whatever Primogems you've already saved up, as well as any free Primogems that you may be able to get in the second half of this patch.
Shadows of fate. Everlasting as the moon.
So normally I'd start discussing what's new with Arlecchino's rerun, but let's just cut straight to the chase and talk about something that I think 99% of y'all are much more interested in, which is of course whether or not Arlecchino is stronger than Mavuika or vice versa. Mavuika is a stronger character than Arlecchino. There we go, I said it. I said it. Between these two characters, I do recommend the Pyro Archon more. Why is that? It's mainly because Mavuika isn't just an on-field DPS, she can also function as an off-field DPS. There are in fact some cases, like Clorinde OverVape, where she's even a team buffer, so she can do a lot of things. Arlecchino, by comparison, is strictly an on-field DPS character, which does mean that Mavuika, in the grand scheme of things, is just simply more versatile. Now that being said, Mavuika's teams do often need another Natlan character to maximize her potential. Options of course include Xilonen, or Sitlali, Autoron, or even Kachina. Now this of course may feel restrictive right now, but it's likely to become less of an issue as more Natlan characters show up in the game. For example, Aoife. Arlecchino, on the other hand, is completely self-sufficient. She doesn't need specific teammates, she doesn't have regional synergies, or she doesn't even need healers. In fact, she can't use healers. She is completely and utterly independent. She heals herself through her ult. Now, in terms of damage, I think it's not as different as some people may seem to make it out to be. Mainly because, well, Arlecchino tends to use normal attacks as opposed to using charge attacks. One of the things I discussed, I think in my power creep video, is that even though Mavuika's team DPS does end up being higher than Arlecchino's team DPS, Mavuika, I think, only has higher team DPS if you're using her charge attacks, which means it's harder to run characters like Xingqiu and Nilan with Mavuika. Now it turns out, it's not impossible. So, for all intents and purposes, it's team for team. There is a good to fair chance that Mavuika is still doing more damage than Arlecchino. But at the very least, when it comes to normal attacking, and therefore having a much easier time using Xingqiu Yilan with either Arlecchino or Mavuika, Arlecchino does still do more normal attack damage than Mavuika, and it's a pretty noticeable difference. That being said, Mavuika has a huge nuke as part of her ult, so I guess it's all compensated. I'm not 100% sure about that. I suppose one thing that I don't know if anyone's really looked into a lot is whether or not Mavuika's teams without an additional Natlan character still end up outperforming Arlecchino teams. We are, of course, talking about teams where Mavuika can ult either... Well, she'll have to ult every other rotation, and her ult probably doesn't have full fighting spirit bonuses, so it's going to be a little bit finicky, in my opinion. At that point, I think Arlecchino should outperform Mavuika in those teams, specifically from a team DPS or DPR perspective. Of course, at the end of the day, I don't know about you, but I play video games to have fun. So, I suppose one way to look at it is, who's more fun to play? Yeah, Mavuika's still more fun to play than Arlecchino. Look, recency bias is going to play a factor into this, of course, but I think it's really got to be Mavuika's bike. And I know a lot of people don't like her bike. I think that's the wrong perspective. I like her bike a lot. It's absolute pure chaos. And if you happen to use her 7-second infinite Night Soul duration from her ult, this is of course the Crucible of Life and Death state, then you get to do all sorts of crazy things. You don't just have to charge attack, you can normal attack, you can dash, you can jump, you can even plunge for free during that 7-second infinite Night Soul duration. It's pretty damn cool. Yeah, I think Mavuika's playstyle just ends up being both fresher and also more dynamic. So yeah, TLDR, I think Mavuika is a more versatile and fun character than Arlecchino, but Arlecchino is still a really solid, independent and reliable character, so she's definitely a solid choice. If you don't have Mavuika, then I reckon you should pull for Mavuika. If you do have Mavuika and you're considering Arlecchino, well then maybe you should stick around for the next section, because there is in fact another surprise character that I think is worth being part of your Arlecchino rerun considerations.
Hear the echoes of the valley! Yeah! Busted! Things are about to get dicey. Run from the sky! You too will experience the suffering.
Since Arlecchino's release back in version 4.6, there has been a few new characters that have showed up that can be quite interesting in various Arlecchino teams, so let's get into it. Of course, obviously the first one is going to have to be Sigewinne, where she could probably be a decent healer in any Arlecchino Farina team variant, but at the very least you can also get some additional Hydro app, I think, just a smidge at the very least, so there's that. But Sigewinne mainly buffs skill damage, so that's mainly buffing Farina's damage at least. Then of course we have Emily, mainly for those who feel a little bit freaky and want to play Virgin or Burning Arlecchino. I don't know anyone who does that. I don't really recommend it myself, but it's an option, I guess. Kachina then came around with the start of Natlan. She can use the scroll set. She can be somewhat useful in that regard, so there we go. But all of that changed when Xilonen showed up. Xilonen is busted. I did an entire video series on why Xilonen is absolutely broken. Feel free to check that out if you want. All of this to say, even in the rare situations where Xilonen not having any off-field geo damage might be a problem, at least for Arlecchino, it's not really a problem at all, because you can just swap out of Arlecchino momentarily to refresh Xilonen's buffs, so that's really, really good. Meanwhile, Autolon showed up, and Autolon can be a perfectly fun alternative for Official in various OverVape teams with Arlecchino, especially in AoE content. But I do find that Autolon tends to be a much more scuffed option in Father's Overload teams, so if you are going to play Autolon in an Overload team like a Chevy team, you probably want to be using Mavuika instead. Then of course Mavuika showed up, and I just talked about Mavuika. But there is also a team with both Arlecchino and Mavuika that actually works pretty well. And finally, as of right now, well as of recording anyway, we have Sitlali. Sitlali, being a cryo character, can also make all of Arlecchino's Vape and Melt teams even more degenerate and busted with relative ease. Lanyan is also coming alongside Arlecchino's rerun. I hear she's decent. So there we go. On top of that, we do have another new character that came out right after Arlecchino, who's also rerunning alongside Arlecchino. I am of course referring to Clorinde. If you have any primos left, and you're wondering whether or not you should get Arlecchino, I would recommend making one more consideration. Are you trying to pull for meta, or are you just trying to pull to have some characters that are fun to play? If you're pulling for meta, then yeah, I probably recommend Arlecchino over Clorinde. I think she's a little bit stronger. But if you are pulling a character to try and have a better enjoyment of the game, I highly recommend Clorinde over Arlecchino. Now, it's not that Arlecchino isn't a fun character to play. She is. But Clorinde is still easily the most exciting, dynamic, and overall enjoyable character to play, in my opinion. She has a gun. Now, for those who have Mavuika, and therefore you have a strong Pyro DPS, yeah, I'd say consider going for Clorinde. But if you don't have Mavuika, and instead you have, let's say, the Raiden Shogun, then you have a strong Electro DPS character, in which case, yeah, you should probably go for Arlecchino. That's definitely some way of maybe helping make your decision. At the end of the day, Arlecchino is in a terrific place, despite being possibly power crept by Mavuika. Especially as demonstrated in the newest Spiral Abyss, there is always one thing that is better than having a really strong Pyro DPS called Mavuika, and that is having two strong Pyro DPSs called Arlecchino and Mavuika.
Hands where I can see 'em! Stop right there! Pyroclastic surge! Rev the engines!
Generally speaking, there's two teams that I tend to play Arlecchino in, and that is of course Vape and Vape. And the difference between these two Vape teams is basically whether or not I choose to run Xilonen or Farina as the Hydro character, or both. Sometimes that feels absolutely necessary. Now, there's no other section of the video where I could fit this in, so I just wanted to quickly remind everyone how Arlecchino's Blood Debt directives work. See, if you're going up against a single target, then what you should probably do is start with Father's skill, then let it cook by setting up the rest of the team, and then you can charge attack with Father, and you can dash cancel that charge attack, and then you start popping off. However, if you go up against 3 or more enemies, and they're all relatively close to you, you can actually just use her skill into a charge attack and then start setting up the rest of your team. Because that way you'll still get your maximum bond of life from that one single skill. So that's really, really good. It's not a super duper important thing to remember, but it is something that you can do so that you don't have to risk accidentally deleting an aura later on after you've set up with the rest of your team using a charge attack. You can actually just go straight into smacking enemies with your normal attacks, which is exactly what you want to do. Now, if I were to play Arlecchino with someone like Xilonen, I would be relying on a shielder like Dongli, or Citlali, or Diona even. Now that I think about it, C6 Diona can be very, very good with Arlecchino. These days though, if I can, I tend to bring Xilonen instead, because like I mentioned, Xilonen is just completely and utterly broken. And with the third and final slot on a team like this, I tend to find that bringing a buffer, a support, tends to be the way to go. Now, of course, Arlecchino is an attack scaler, so there is, of course, one attack buffer who is a very strong option for her. I hope you know who I'm talking about, so let's all say their name at the count of 3. 1, 2, 3, Sarah. That's right, and what's great about Kujo Sarah, this is of course something I outlined in my Sarah video, is that without having to deal with any circle impacts, I can freely run around as Arlecchino in my Vape team, so that's really, really good. And what's great about Arlecchino is that because you can momentarily swap out, you can actually use that to reapply Sarah's buff. That basically means that with C2 Sarah, you have a buff duration of 12 seconds on a 10-second cooldown, which, if you do the math, you may find should be a more than 100% uptime on her buff. So that is why Sarah is a fantastic choice for Arlecchino teams. I also want to mention the Arlecchino Mavuika double Pyro Vape team, which is a thing that can happen specifically if you haven't as much Hydro app as Xilonen or more. So it doesn't work with Farina, but it works with Xilonen. And it can be very strong because it leverages Mavuika's off-field pyro damage as well as the buffs that you get from Mavuika's ult as part of her passive. I did an entire video on this, so feel free to check it out. Now, the team can be almost identical to the Farina variant as well. Yes, there are Arlecchino Farina teams that exist. However, I do find myself enjoying running Mona as an alternative healer in these teams, as well as running my newly C2 the higher, because why not? Now, this of course does end up being another double Pyro Vape team, and does look a little bit like my father Mavuika team, but Mavuika is probably not going to be a great choice in this team because, number one, you'll probably want to bring Xilonen, or I guess Medic Sitlali. And if you do that, then I suspect what tends to happen is you won't have enough Hydro app. I mean, if you're just running Farina by herself, I can already tell you won't have enough Hydro app, so the Xilonen variant already doesn't work. I'm not 100% sure about the Sitlali variant, but it probably doesn't work either. Farina's Hydro app is both inadequate and just simply too unreliable to sustain Father and Mavuika in my experience. But Mona and Farina can sustain Father and Dahaya, so that's really good. The main thing is that unlike Xilonen variants, you typically won't find yourself at maximum Bond of Life because Farina is draining your health. So you will be using your ult more often, which means you will be resetting your Bond of Life more often. That means the Bond of Life itself will not be contributing as much to your Arlecchino hits, but in place of that, we do have team-wide damage buffs coming from both Mona and Farina, as well as interruption resistance, damage mitigation, and also, well, depending on how you build your higher damage coming from her. Sometimes I also run Chevy Overload teams, my general favorite of course being with Sarah and Yaibiko, and then there's plenty of alternatives to play around with, Fischl, Beidou, Fuliara Lisa, but unless it's absolutely necessary, I'm not a huge fan of triple Pyro Chevy teams with someone like the Haya for damage reduction or Xiangling, but you can still make it work with C2 Sarah because you just have to weave Sarah in on the regular and make sure your crow feathers don't run out. This of course ends up making the team pretty good against Tulpa. This recent Spiral Abyss has also opened my eyes to Melt Arlecchino, which I suppose has always been a pretty legitimate team for her. It's definitely stronger if you happen to have someone like Sitlali, but in my experience, just running Diona, Sarah, and Rosaria was actually pretty damn good. It just means you can't spam your normal attacks like you can with Vape teams, so there is a bit of hickory-pokery going on in there. Because of that, I kind of do prefer the Vape teams with Arlecchino myself, but I do want to acknowledge that the Melt teams very much exist.
Stabilize!
Busted. Things are about to get dicey.
Building Arlecchino is pretty straightforward. She benefits from reaching 3000 attack due to her A4 passive, which of course gives her some elemental and physical resistance based on her attack above 1000. This of course does make her tankier, can be useful if she only has to heal herself through her ult, but it's not essential, especially if you're running shielders, but it's definitely worth noting. Now, by my understanding, outside attack buffs from someone like Sarah, they don't count, but attack percent buffs from someone like Chevy actually does. So, with that in mind, let's have a look at how we build Arlecchino. Her best weapon is of course going to be her signature, the Scythe. Now, any spear on Arlecchino will get a ghostly scythe effect, but the Scythe actually turns into a scythe when she wields it, because that's how Arlecchino works. She is a spear user, but she's not really a spear user. So, with regards to the weapons, yeah, the Scythe is both a damage choice and also a drip choice as well. That being said, you don't have to feel pressured to actually pull for the Scythe. Jadewig Spear is a solid alternative. It has of course been featured in various Xiao reruns and will be available in the Liyue Chronicle banner. Of course, if you're going to be choosing between the Scythe and Primordial Jade Wing Spear in this current rerun, then yeah, you should definitely go for the Scythe. But any other 5-star DPS spear is absolutely perfectly fine. So if you have something just spare, there we go. For 4-star options, on the other hand, Ballad of the Fjords I think is really good, especially in teams with 3 different elements, which is relatively easy because Sarah is of course an electro character. So this is not really going to be a thing in Chevy Overload teams, so just keep that in mind. Deathmatch on the other hand is also a very strong pick, and I guess if you're desperate, you may have an R5 white tassel sitting around, maybe, if you happen to have one. Then Sarah-based teams with white tassel can actually do the trick. Meanwhile, with artifacts, you're pretty much choosing between either Whimsy or Gladiator. For Arlecchino, Whimsy is strictly stronger than Gladiator. They both have the same 2-piece effect, but Gladiator has a 35% normal attack bonus compared to Whimsy's 54% all damage bonus. However, as of recording, it's currently 2025 and we're still in the Natlan patch cycle, so Gladiator is more readily available from various bosses and of course the strong box. You will need to go out of your way to farm Whimsy instead, so unless you have a character that would love the burning artifact set, you're pretty much a-okay with Gladiator. Otherwise, of course, 2-piece with Crimson is a choice, but you're probably feeling a bit more desperate for that. To put things into perspective, I am running a very scuffed Whimsy build, but if you have a look at the footage in this video, my Arlecchino is still popping off, and that may be partly thanks to Primordial Jade Wing Spear. So Gladiators is absolutely perfectly fine. For the artifact stats, you're going to usually go for attack, pyro, crit. You can try and run an EM stand if you have a particularly good one, of course in a reaction team. Then for Arlecchino's Constellations, say it with me, you don't need any of her Constellations for Arlecchino to be very strong. That being said, C1 is of course more damage and some interruption resistance, so it's definitely better for those shieldless, the hireless teams. C2 is of course going to be some big front-loaded damage. For context, Arlecchino's C2 is a 900% attack nuke, whereas Mavuika's ult nuke at full fighting spirit at level 10 is 800% plus 200 times nearly 3%. You basically end up with 1376% attack as that nuke. And Mavuika's ult nukes are famously doing, even right now, upwards of 300k, 400k, 500k damage in that hit. So that C2 from Arlecchino, I think should be doing somewhere around the 200 to 400,000 damage mark. Yeah, it's a big hit. C3 is of course normal attack levels, which is going to be the majority of her damage. C5 is actually ult levels, which is just more damage from her ult. It's not that important. C4 is cooldown reduction on her skill as well as additional energy. I don't think it's also that important either. In my experience, I have never really worried about Arlecchino's energy generation, with some rare exceptions being some intense skill issues. On top of that, I've never really worried about Arlecchino's skill cooldown because of the way that I tend to play Arlecchino, having her start at the front. So, because of that, yeah, I think her C4 is not that useful either. And finally we have C6, which is just your standard crazy C6 for 5-star characters. Arlecchino's ult basically nukes even harder than ever before, plus her normal attacks do even more damage. Completely unnecessary, and yet, you know, the big whale channels tend to enjoy C6 Arlecchino. So yeah, Arlecchino is pretty easy to build, flexible with all of her weapons, and doesn't really demand Constellations in order to pop off. She's already strong right out of the gate, and whether or not you go all in with Whimsy, or if you just, you know, keep it simple by running Gladiators instead, she is still precisely the harbinger that you're expecting.
Right here, right now, emerge. Stop right there! Flash! No turning back! I'm always watching. Right now. Oh! Emerge. Right now. Emerge, right now, right here.
Let me say this one more time. Should you get father? Sure. Or maybe not. Really depends on your account and who you are. At the same time though, she's really strong. She's quite fun to play. So, there are reasons to get her. But Clorinde first, because Clorinde's more fun to play. Have I made your decision to pull her any easier? Let me know what you think about all of this in the comments below. How do you feel about Arlecchino and her rerun? Let me know in the comments. Otherwise, hope you guys enjoyed. If you like this video, hit that like button, subscribe for more Genshin Impact action, and until next time, I will see you guys later. Thanks for watching. Bye.
Have a taste of purgatory. Game's up. Fun's over. Strike! Not bad. You've proven to be a worthy opponent after all. Here comes the catch. Not bad. You've proven to be a worthy opponent after all.
Order guide.
My blade is all that remains. Quietly now. Gotcha. Things are about to get dicey. Quiver! No turning back!
Stabilize.
Sundown is only the beginning. Busted. Gotcha. Game's up.